Yeah, cool. All right, come on in. Enjoy it. Hi, aloha. Good to see you again. Hey, how's it, brother? How you been, man? Oh, so good to see you.
I've been missing all the other ones.
Well, this is a different one, but hi, Ed Case. Good to see you. Ed, good morning. Aloha to everybody. First of all, I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for spending your Saturday morning on such an incredibly beautiful day with us here on some very important stuff. But nonetheless, it is a lot nicer outside than in here. I've been in this room many times throughout my career. I think the most recent was about 3 years ago, testifying to the state legislature. I'm sorry I'm way up here. I don't really like the design, you know, so it's a little weird for us to be way up here above you all. But let's get over that and get on to the subject at hand. I'm Congressman Ed Case. I served you in Hawaii from 02 to 07 in Congress, and then I got out for a while and came back last year, 2018. My term of service is 2 years. I represent the 1st Congressional District, which is, and you all know that we have 2 congressional districts. The 1st Congressional is basically Honolulu proper. So from Makapu'u Point in the east to Mililani on the north and Ko'olina on the west, I take that entire urban core. My colleague Tulsi Gabbard has District 2, which is the rest of Oahu, and all of the rest of the islands. And I also represented District 2, my prior service, and I'm a product of District 2. I'm born and raised in Hilo. And so, you know, that's a long way of saying that although I represent the 1st Congressional, I think it's a long-standing tradition for all of us in Congress from Hawaii that we essentially operate at large. So we all feel that we're responsible for the entire state. And so everything that I talk about here is designed for wide application throughout the state. How can our federal government help our Hawaii? In other words, how can Hawaii be served by our federal government? Now that comes in a lot of different ways. That comes in the context of laws and how they apply to Hawaii. That comes in the context of the application of those laws through regulations, and it comes in the context of federal funding, which is what we'll get to. The third part of my job, by the way, is to help you with your individual issues. So whether they be Veterans Affairs or Social Security, that is a part of my job, to make sure our federal government treats each and all of us equally and with full respect for its obligations to us. And sometimes good-meaning people in the federal government don't do that for whatever reason. And so a little intercession from your congressman sometimes can work wonders, and we're happy to do that. So that's something that we do. So those are the 3 parts of my job. I'm focusing on number 2, but I don't want to leave out the others. In terms of partisanship, I would also note that although on the national leadership level, there's a lot of partisanship going on right now, a lot of division. For the most part, we all try to help each other from a federal funding perspective. We all try to help a state that has had a disaster. We all try to help a state with its military commitments or its social services. And of course, casework should be very non-political, and I've found that to be the case, having worked as a Democrat with Republican administrations both times. People inside the government try to stay away from all of that. So let's talk federal funding. Let's talk about the actual issues having to do with how is our federal government able to help us here, particularly with funding. But the second thing is I want to hear back from you. What's going right? What's not going right? Where can we, me and my colleagues in Congress, maximize the areas to seek federal support? This is a partnership. It is me trying to make sure that you are fully educated about what the opportunities are. It is you telling me what the needs are. It is you saying, hey, in this area we don't have enough federal support. I can go try to authorize legislation, appropriate funds for that. And I can also try to facilitate the focus on these programs inside of the federal government. A quick story on that. I was at Chaminade University, and we have folks from Chaminade here yesterday and today. And basically our discussion was, and Chaminade has done an outstanding job of accessing federal grants and support in many areas, but in some places it's running into a little bit of a brick wall. Why is that? Because the federal agencies are not familiar with Hawaii. Sometimes, in all honesty, people have a little bit of a prejudice about whether they should give the federal money out to Hawaii. They don't understand. It's not a prejudice in a bad way, it's just a prejudice in the non-understanding way, if you know what I mean. And sometimes you got to kind of educate them that we do the best in the world in many, many areas, and we have needs. And so we're looking to hear back from you. I've got an incredible staff that is joining me here today. Right here I've got Nestor Garcia, my communications director, also former city council member. I have Jackie Conant right there. Many of you have already asked me whether you could come meet with me. I will meet with anybody, all of you, if you want to meet with me. I'm here for 3 weeks this time around, going back in early September. Jackie is the person to contact if you would like to get together. If you'd like me to, somebody said, can I come down and talk to your political science class at UH? I'm happy to do that kind of stuff. Jackie is the entry point. She runs my office here. Then we have Connor Smith back there, who is my legislative assistant from Washington, D.C. Tim Nelson is my overall chief of staff, and he does a lot of the federal grants work in the military area. And then we have Kimberly Ryan here, who is one of my great caseworkers right here in Honolulu. And we've got a couple of other folks outside. Okay, let me start. My program here is to give you an overview of the federal funding process. Many of you know this stuff, some of you may not. One of the things that happened to me when I was elected to Congress this time was that I was appointed to the House Appropriations Committee. And as you'll see here, the Appropriations Committee is where funding for all discretionary funding out of our federal government starts, about $1.4 trillion annually. It has to start in that committee. And as a result, that committee is a very powerful, exclusive committee. It's very hard to get on. I was fortunate to get on that committee. It's the first time in 30 some odd years that anybody from Hawaii has been on that committee. The last person was Daniel Akaka when he was serving in the United States House. And so my goal here is to make sure that for the time I have in Congress representing Hawaii and for the time I'm on this committee, I'm making full use of this committee for Hawaii. We've already been through one cycle. And we did very, very well, but that was under a lot of time pressure because, I got elected, I got sworn in on January 3rd. I was on the Appropriations Committee on January 15th. I had to have all of my submissions in by the end of February. If I didn't know what the process was already going in, I'd be dead in the water. And so we were very helpful, with the help, by the way, of a lot of you. Let's do an overview of the federal government and kind of kick it off, and I'm going to turn it over to our panel, and then we are going to have a discussion, and then we're going to turn it over to you for your questions. And I would also say that I did promise in advertising this talk story that once we get through this part of it, if anybody wants to cover any other areas, I'm happy to do that. I am doing a full set of talk stories throughout my entire district, 5 of them, plus one electronic one in October. So we'll be in your neighborhood in October, available to talk about anything you want, but if there's anything you want to talk about today, let us get through this and then I'll stick around. Okay, next. Okay, it's a little blurry, but I'll just go through it. Federal Spending 101. First of all, our federal fiscal year starts on October 1st. It starts on October 1st. That's not the same as other fiscal years, which makes it very confusing when you get to interacting with our state government and our county government, because everybody has a different fiscal year. We start October 1st, and that drives every single thing that we do in Congress from a federal appropriations perspective, including whether the government shuts down or not, because the current fiscal authority to spend money expires on September 30th. So we have to get the appropriations process for next year done by September 30th. Otherwise, the stuff hits the fan just like it did in December. Federal spending, appropriations, we refer to spending as appropriations, to appropriate the money, it's in our Constitution, is the prerogative of Congress, not of the administration, which sometimes administrations forget, Democrat and Republican. It must start in Congress by our Constitution. The administration cannot spend independent of Congress. Now, sometimes we give the administration a lot of flexibility in terms of how to spend the money that we appropriate to the administration. In fact, most of the money is appropriated to the administration and then they decide exactly how to spend it. But it has to start in Congress. And so that's what we do every year. We do appropriations bills in order to meet this deadline. Number 3, federal spending is split into 2 categories. One is mandatory non-discretionary, and the second is discretionary. Mandatory non-discretionary is funding that goes on from year to year. You don't actually have to act on it every year. A perfect example of that is Social Security benefits. We're not going to appropriate Social Security benefits every single year. Another example of that would be veterans benefits. And there are other examples. And actually, this is the biggest part of federal spending, as you'll see in a second. But the part that we deal with every day and that is completely relevant to federal funding for Hawaii, other than for Social Security benefits, veterans benefits, and other non-discretionary spending, is our discretionary spending, which is close to $1.4 trillion a year. I've already said this, mandatory spending is ongoing, Social Security and veterans benefits. Discretionary is everything else, and it starts in the House Appropriations Committee, which is why that committee, my committee, is so important. And I'll also mention this because we're about to get to it. The committee splits up into 12 subcommittees, which basically divvy up the areas that our federal government functions in. So there's 12 of them. So for example, one is defense spending, which is the biggest single one. And the other ones roughly follow the federal departments, but not exactly. So you also are able not only to influence everything on the Appropriations Committee, since you are a member of that committee, but if you're on certain subcommittees, you are particularly able to influence those, because at that point you're down to only about 8 to 10 members on that subcommittee who are controlling everything in that area. So my subcommittees are military construction and veterans affairs, particularly important here to Hawaii. So I'm able to influence military construction and vets. And then the second one is commerce, science, and justice. So commerce is all of the economic development, tourism. It has the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So I've done a lot of work on science-related stuff to include the University of Hawaii. And justice, which is everything other than the federal judiciary. The Justice Department does all law enforcement, many grants to ensure human rights, and we have representatives of the State Attorney General here who access those grants. Okay, next. Okay, this is a quick breakdown. We've talked a little bit about this already. Total is $4.1 trillion. That's our current budget, of which mandatory is the greatest portion. We've already talked about that. This is, by the way, one of our major problems from a long-term budget perspective, because these are entitlements. These are lifelines to people. These are things that people expect to have. They've paid into, and these are accelerating. And then we've got interest, which is also a huge problem. That's our federal debt, which has increased rapidly in the last decade. And this component is increasing. So you know from your own family or business that if your interest payments start to get out of control, your entire budget's going to start to fall apart, and that's a concern. This number is, and it crowds out the rest of it. And then finally we've got discretionary divided into defense, about half of it, and non-defense, about half of it. Okay, next. Okay, so let's break down the federal discretionary, 1.3 to 1.4 trillion. Now this gets a little small to see, but defense is half of it. We spend a lot of money on defense in this country, and that's a great source of debate throughout our country. We spend more GDP-wise than many nations, almost all of them except nations like Israel, for example. And that's the concern of it. I guess silver bullet, if you are silver lining in that, if you want to put it that way, is that Hawaii obviously benefits from that. Hawaii that's our number 2 economic driver, is our military here. And then other big ones would be labor, health, and human services and education at 14%. So all of our labor programs, many of our social services programs. We've also got military construction VA. This is my subcommittee here. We've got commerce, science, and justice, pretty big, my other subcommittee. And we've got Homeland Security, which is increasing. And then we've got some, policy calls, in all honesty, from my perspective, where they have very small portions, but they're incredibly important. One of them would be Interior and Environment, 3%. That's pretty small from a big picture perspective. Nonetheless, 3% of 1.3 trillion is still a lot of money. And so these monies are all, for the most part, largely, appropriated to the administration, and they then flow to the states and the counties and the private sector in the form of awards, programs, grants. Okay, direct federal spending. Direct federal funding, by that what I refer to is funding that actually is paid out to nonprofits or other sources, not just state and county governments. I think I have another slide after this that goes to money that comes through the state and county government. So I got this a little bit in reverse. So let's just talk about this. Most of the money that comes out of the federal government appropriations goes to the state and county governments to pay for state and county government programs. And the state and the county governments also have their own grant programs, which obviously you are entitled to apply for and get, and they administer. So I don't have a direct role in that. My role is to get the money to the state and the county governments, then they spend it. And so there's two parts of this. One is the state and county government money, and then this is the one where these would go directly to nonprofits and other sources. And there are two types. In the appropriations bill itself, which is referred to as earmarks. So let's say I pass an appropriations bill saying, you are charged to appropriate $5 million to the University of Hawaii for this particular project. That's an earmark because it can't be used for anything else. Now, earmarks fell out of favor because they were abused. And we do not technically have earmarks anymore. There's a movement to bring earmarks back because many of us, and I'm one of them, I feel like I know my state better than anybody else in the whole country. My state better than anybody else inside the administration, certainly. And I know whether that's a valid project or not. I should be able to appropriate the money to a particular project. But there is subject to abuse, the bridge to nowhere, that kind of stuff. And so earmarks are not present anymore. However, little game we play with earmarks. Sometimes you can describe a program such that there's really only a couple of people that are eligible to fulfill it. So let's say that I said, let's appropriate so much money to the research into tropical coral reef diseases. Well, there's not that many places that actually do tropical coral reef disease research. So the chances are Hawaii will get a little bit of that money. And then finally, administered by the executive branch. So this is what I'm talking about, where that money goes to the federal government. Some of it goes down to the state and local governments, but most of it stays in the federal government, available for federal grants and programs. Okay, next. A little bit about the importance of federal funding to our Hawaii. This is our total state of Hawaii budget, $14 billion. Of which $2.7 billion is federal funding to the state of Hawaii. This is not to the counties, this is not to private nonprofits, this is to the state. And federal funding thus is 19% of our state budget. So federal funding is very, very important to us. And it breaks down in a number of different categories, and this is small stuff down here, and I'll just read it. The biggest one is Medicaid, so to take care of the health care needs of the needy. Incredibly important. The federal government doesn't run that. It gives the money to the states, and the state run that, but that's the biggest component. This is a major area for our state because we have many, many demands on our Medicaid money. One would be, for example, Compact of Free Association residents here who are entitled by law to those services, and yet there's a tremendous financial consequence to that. Department of Human Services administers many of our social safety net programs, women and infant children, supplemental, basically food stamps, what used to be regarded as food stamps. DOE, major part of federal funding is DOE. Major component of federal funding goes to our DOE, both for direct administration and for grants. And then transportation. Our federal government has a huge portion of our support for our airports, for our highways, and for our harbors. And then you can see from there on. Again, DL&R gets hardly any, which I think is a bit of a tragedy. So, I certainly believe that we should try to accelerate these appropriations up here. There's some really important stuff in here. For example, look at the Attorney General. DNA backlog reduction. This is where we have unsolved crimes, but we have DNA. From those unsolved crimes, and yet we don't have the resources to analyze it. Rape cases would be one example. The federal government has a piece of that, and the University of Hawaii gets a huge portion as well. Okay, next. Let's do it for the city and county of Honolulu. The same basic program, total budget $3.2 billion, federal funding $48 million, roughly 15%. Big ones, transportation. A lot of transportation monies from our federal government to our city. Same basic program. Department of Health and Human Services has a big chunk. Social safety net programs, and then you can see others would be Department of Housing and Urban Development, community development block grants, which are very, very important to maintenance of strong communities. Again, I would say that this money is going to the city like the state, but the city and the state administer this money by making, in part, by making grants to others. And so everything I'm talking about here today applies to the city and the state. We've got the city and the state here to talk a little bit about that, okay? Okay, now what goes on in my head from an appropriations perspective? This is the basic timeline that I function under, and I'm going to do this real fast. First Monday in February, again, remember the fiscal year starts in October, so we're talking about the next fiscal year. The president submits his budget. The president says what he or she thinks should be spent and how that money should be raised. It is not binding on Congress. It is advisory. It is nothing more than that. Sometimes presidents think that, you know, their word should be followed, and the Congress kind of says, well, that's not what the Constitution says. And we said that this year, by the way, for sure, because that budget was not the right budget. We then have a deadline, internal deadline from the Appropriations Committee for all members to submit their request to the Appropriations Committee. Now there are 12 subcommittees, and you're limited to 75 requests per subcommittee. Now you would think that there might be hard to come up with 75 requests for 12 subcommittees. It's not. There's a lot of needs out there. And we certainly did outreach, and we basically had that. So whatever that math equals, we made somewhere around 900 requests to the Appropriations Committee. We're supposed to pass a budget by April 15th. We haven't passed a budget for many, many years now. It's a little bit of a tragedy. It's tough to pass a budget. Congress avoids it and goes straight to appropriations, which it can do. It shouldn't do, but it does. And then in May and June, the committees start to mark up their appropriations bills. Markup means we actually get them before the committee, we talk about them, we think about them, we amend them, hopefully report them out to the full House. And then June, July, we vote on our appropriations bills and send them to the other chamber. And then if there are differences, which there always are, we conference on them. And then in September, we're supposed to come to final passage, give them to the president. The president has, this is a law. The president has time to, you know, veto veto any one of them if he or she wants. And then, in an ideal world, we pass all of our appropriations bills by October 1st. Now, there's a lot of stuff that's been happening in appropriations and budgeting over the last decade that is nothing like what I just described to you. We don't have budgets. We don't always pass bills by the October 1st deadline, which causes the government to shut down, which causes absolute havoc throughout our country. And in some cases, we're not ready to pass it, but we're willing to fund it. That's called a continuing resolution, which is a fancy way of saying, we didn't get our work done, but so just spend as much as you were spending last year while we figure out how to do this year. Is that confusing enough? No. Bottom line, we actually do have a process. We actually do relatively follow it in terms of the appropriations committees. What's happening this year, by the way? The House actually passed out 10 out of 12 of our appropriations bills, and they're in the Senate right now. The Senate hasn't passed any yet. Obviously, we're getting pretty close to September 1st, and so when I go back in early September, we better start to pass appropriations bills pretty fast. Either that or we'll try to continue them. Nobody wants to shut down the government again. Okay, I think I'm going to skip this for now because I've taken up too much time, but basically, these are some charts that I can come back to that outline what I need from you to help you with your appropriations requests. Now, all of what I'm saying is on my website, case.house.gov. We've got a special portion of my website that is devoted to how we help you with your grants, how we help you with your appropriations. And one thing I would say two things. First of all, when you're thinking about a grant, when you're thinking about federal funding needs, contact us to talk it through up front. What's the best way to do this? What's the best grant to try to access? How can I help you with a supporting letter? With appropriations, I have to make those requests to my appropriations committee. I'm already working on appropriations for the next fiscal year, so my deadline is February, is it leap year next year? February, whatever it is next year, I've got to get those in. Now, I don't want to rush it in 6 weeks. I want to take half a year to get that right. And I've got to prioritize. And I have to defend it to the Appropriations Committee, so that means I've got to understand it, to articulate it. That means working with you on that. There are additional resources that you can access. The Congressional Research Service is the Library of Congress, and it runs one of the best libraries in the world. I mean, it is the best library in the world, and it runs a service devoted to helping Congress. And it does publications that are relevant to our constituents' needs. And they have great publications here. One is how to develop and write a grant proposal, examples of grant proposals and requests, and tips on writing a competitive grant proposal. So try to access all of those. And I think I've got a handout, right? We have a handout. Questions. All of this is on my website and on the handout. Please contact us, my Washington, D.C. Honolulu office. For appropriations and general government questions, Anthony Ching is my policy advisor. He's in charge of overall appropriations. And for grants, Asami Kobayashi right here. The important thing to remember here is that, first of all, I have a great staff. A lot of folks that are experienced. All of them, in one way or the other, are from Hawaii, and they know Hawaii very, very well. So you don't have to educate them on, where Kaimuki is or something like that. I think that the other thing to note is that the way I organize my office is that here in Hawaii, I handle all of my local relations and my casework. And I handle all of the entry into my office. And in Washington, D.C., we do our legislation. We centralize our appropriations. We obviously can talk to you from either office. But the entry is going to be Jackie Conant, or you're welcome to go directly to any of my staff here. So with that, thank you so much for an incredible morning and for all of your comments about federal funding and other subjects. Thank you. How's it? How are you? Good to see you. Aloha. How are you? Good to see you.
You must be busy. I don't see you jogging Kaneohe now.
I know. I haven't jogged there for a while. Good morning. Aloha to everybody. Aloha. Thank you so much for joining me and your Congress today. I am joined by Kristen Baumgart-Turner from Representative Gabbard's office. So consider this a joint congressional meeting. Informal as it is, we're still trying to get information on how we can help Hawaii. Also, we will be, of course, reporting back to Senators Schatz and Hirono on this meeting because we all work very closely together in this department. A couple of logistical issues. First of all, these mics are live, and this is a public meeting, and so anybody that knows how to tune into the House, House broadcasting system is listening, and we do have members of the media here. And so I hope that today what I want to do is very straightforward. I want to figure out systematically how we in Congress can help Hawaii in protecting our natural resources. That's my charge here today. And I do so from the perspective of being not only a believer in protecting our natural resources, but as a member of the House Appropriations Committee, where I get to influence federal funding in this area, and B, a member of the House Natural Resources Committee, which sets overall federal policy and authorizes the expenditure of money for our natural resources to include national parks, national this, national that. I am also in that committee on the subcommittees on national parks and federal lands, which is exactly what it sounds like. That has jurisdiction over all federal lands, and also the subcommittee on water, oceans, and wildlife. So bottom line, from my perspective, I'm pretty uniquely situated to do something, and we've already done many things. We've sponsored national legislation on many of the areas that we're all concerned about. But what I think has been missing from my agenda really is to go back and I've done kind of scattershot stuff here and there throughout Hawaii in terms of advancing initiatives to protect our natural resources. But this is for me an opportunity to listen to you and to try to form some priorities because I have a 2-year term. It's not guaranteed I'm going to be on these committees if I am reelected. And so I want to make the best use of my time to get things started. All right. Well, let me kind of set the stage in the big picture in terms of the things that I'm working on and worrying about at a national level, and some of which directly impacts Hawaii. First of all, I think we all know that this is I think it's fair to say a difficult time for the environment and for natural resource protection throughout our country. It's not particularly highly prioritized in the current administration or in Washington. And as a result, if you take a look at any measure of the federal funding allocations, you'll see that environmental protection and natural resource protection is not particularly proportionally funded, at least at the level that all of us would think that it should be. So, I mean, the first thing to say, I think it goes without saying, but let's just get it on the table and off the table, is I think we all agree that federal support overall for environmental protection and natural resource protection should be increased from where it is right now. So I just say that that's certainly an effort that I've been pursuing along with my colleagues on the House Appropriations Committee, where we significantly increased the budget coming out of the House this year, current appropriations from both the prior year and the President's budget allocable overall to Department of Interior and other natural resources, Department of Agriculture for areas of land preservation. And so that appropriations bill is sitting in the Senate right now, and we expect and hope that it will come out next month, September, and then go to the President for signature. So hopefully that will mean some increase. Now that takes a while to filter down to us here. So that's number one to discuss. Number two, certainly there have been some successes. The reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund with a increase in authorization, I think was good news to everybody. That was a success, and so let's point out that there are successes. So those are a couple of the areas that are problematic but promising. Some of the areas that are particularly problematic, and I'll get these on and off the table also, unless you want to deal with them more. Certainly, climate change is a number one issue for all of us, whether it be our oceans or environment or impacts on the land, and there are a number of issues and initiatives in Congress on climate change. We have a special climate change committee for the first time ever in the U.S. House that is supposed to be getting us an overall report. We have passed a number of climate change initiatives out of the U.S. House over the last 7 months that I've been there during this hearing. I have supported those initiatives, and also as has Congresswoman Gabbard, and of course Senator Schatz was one of the earliest supporters of or warning calls for climate change, if you go back even to his state legislative days when we served together. So that's definitely on the table going forward. We have, turning to our oceans, a big issue with our oceans, where we are reauthorizing the Magnuson-Stevens Act. The Magnuson-Stevens Act is the principal federal policy initiative to manage our fisheries. And it is coming up for reauthorization next year, and we're already into the discussion process on how should we change that. We have had a lot of discussions, and you've seen a comprehensive report in Civil Beat on the operations of the Western Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which is near and dear to my heart from a perspective of managing the Western Pacific fisheries stock, including the stock that impacts us directly right here in Hawaii. So there's definitely unfinished business in that category on the oceans. Some of you spoke to ocean conservation issues already. We have the continuation of challenges over invasive species, whether they be invasive species on land, but particularly on our oceans. We've had 2 reports in the last 48 hours, one in Papahanaumokuakea and another one in Kaneohe Bay just this morning, as a matter of fact, reported in the press. I'm working on an invasive species bill along those lines in conjunction with the DLNR to try to strengthen our overall federal regime on invasive species, to bring it up to speed with really many of the rest of the places in the rest of the world, like New Zealand, who take this very, very seriously. So those are a couple of the areas, and I'm happy to talk about the big picture here as we get through this discussion. But what I really want to do is to focus on Hawaii in this particular meeting. I've handed out a couple of things to just kind of set the stage a little bit more. The first is a handout, just a summary from the National Park Service of what they're already doing here in Hawaii. As you know, as you can see here, they're pretty active. We have perhaps more than most of us realize when we actually look at this list and start to say, well, what's that, what's that? Now, problematic to this entire list is that probably the biggest challenge we have in our national parks and associated entities is deferred maintenance. We have a report of millions of dollars, actually billions, I should say, of deferred maintenance throughout the entire national park system. And here in Hawaii, all of our national parks are suffering from significant deferred maintenance. We have a report on that that I'm happy to make available to you that really itemizes it in some depth. Haleakala National Park, 24 million. Volcanoes National Park, 92 million, and on down the list. So deferred maintenance is a critical issue for us nationally, but also as it impacts us right here in Hawaii. And then the final thing that I handed out was simply a summary of federally protected lands of the U.S., an overview of the categories of protection that our federal government follows in terms of trying to protect our natural resources. This is federal related, independent of the state and the counties, although obviously we all try to work together on these issues. And so these are categories, and my basic question is, are we taking full advantage of all of these categories? These categories are not exclusive. There's also some categories of protected lands that are kind of like hidden out there that are not fully advantaged. One example would be programs to protect cultural resources. We don't have too many of those here in Hawaii. The final thing I'll mention is that when we talk about protecting our lands and natural resources and resources at the federal level, we tend to think too much about the Department of the Interior because they do in fact run our national parks and national lands system. But there are other departments that are significantly involved in protection of our natural resources. We've already talked about the USDA. They have a lot of work that they do, and thank you very much for your work. And I look forward to you outlining what you do, because I think a lot of people don't know what you do and what the resources are that are available. So with that overview, I would like to just simply open this up. I'd like this to be a complete discussion as opposed to a hearing kind of a thing. To ask you the basic question: what more can our federal government do to help us to protect our natural resources in Hawaii? What are the pukas? What are the areas? One thing I'd like to come out of the meeting with, if it's possible, is some kind of a prioritization of either current initiatives that need to be strengthened in terms of protection, specific areas that we can protect, or areas that we haven't really talked about protecting yet that we can kind of get in the pipeline right now. Where are the critical areas that are in the path of development, where if we get there now, we can protect them over the next couple of generations? We did this with the Ka'u coastline 15 years ago. You were involved in that, Josh, and we're able to protect some of that. What is out there? How can we take advantage of this list? We don't have a national forest in Hawaii. Is that an area that we should think about a national forest, and where? I have, by the way, talked to the National Forest about this. They're good to go. So, just finding they're supportive, and so it's finding the right location and approach, and getting it into the pipeline. And again, I would say that I'm kind of functioning from a. I feel like I'm short on time to get these things in the pipeline because we're in August already. The fall in Congress is going to be pretty weird. It's after the appropriations process, and so really my window is going to be, for all intents and purposes, in my current term, from now until, probably May or June of next year. And I should have mentioned earlier that my appropriations requests, so those are the requests from members to the committee, are due on February 28th of next year. And so for me, it's really, really important to, and that's when I say to the committee, this is what I need, what I want. I prioritize, I describe, I advocate, and we were very successful this year on short notice, but now I want to take a little bit more time to be even better from that perspective. So the better I can organize it, prioritize it, advocate it, working with you, the better chance I have of kind of getting it in the pipeline. Also, from authorizing legislation perspective, I really should be introducing a lot of that authorizing legislation within the next couple of months in order to get it heard in the Natural Resources Committee and then hopefully out of the House. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman.
Okay, anybody else want to tackle what more can the federal government, what areas should we be focusing on? What are the critical areas of Hawaii that are not getting protected now that we really should be protecting, and can the federal government help? We're taking a look at one or two of our fish ponds to see whether we actually can tailor greater federal support to helping that particular fish pond. The one we're looking at is Hawai'i. And there's a national estuarine research federal funding. So that's one thing you wouldn't think about. Can you mix and match fish ponds to estuarine research? Well, of course you can. So that's one area. I really appreciated your comment on the indigenous rights and indigenous education to include climate change. One of the most interesting hearings I had in Congress since I got back, and on natural resources, I outlined two of the committees I'm on: Water, Oceans, Wildlife, and National Parks and Federal Lands. But the third one I'm on is the Committee on Indigenous Peoples, which is responsible for all federal efforts on indigenous peoples, so Native Americans, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiians. In this area, there's a lot of, like the USDA a little bit, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how, and there's not a lot of funding, but there's a fair bit of flexibility to try to get federal support for various programs. But anyway, on the subject of climate change, every single one of the 6 committees on natural resources held a hearing on climate change. We had not had any hearings on climate change in Congress, in the House at least. I'm not going to speak for the Senate, for 15 years or something like that. I'm sorry, I take it back, for 9 years, since 2010. And everyone did it. And so we had one particular hearing in which we had indigenous peoples from throughout our country come in and talk about the impact on their lands, their lifestyles, their culture of climate change. So we had the impact of climate change on traditional fishing rights, hunting. I didn't get to it fast enough to include the Native Hawaiian perspective on that panel, but it was a fascinating panel, and clearly right to your point. So I think we might be able to do stuff with that over time. Let's just talk about invasive species a little bit more, because I kind of brushed by it earlier on. First of all, biocontrol, fully supported; eradication, fully supported, but they're already here, right? So the big problem is the gateway to start with.
Right.
And I just think we're completely inadequate on that still, especially if you take a look at the rest of the world. When I was in Congress the last time, late in my term, so I didn't really have a chance to work on it enough, I introduced a bill called the Hawaii Invasive Species Act. And in so many words, what it said was, what's good for California is good for Hawaii. So, you know, stuff coming in gets the same degree of inspection and protocols as what we're required to do going on out for fruit flies, et cetera. And I still think, in theory, that's the right way to go. Other countries do it. I mentioned New Zealand earlier. They're world leaders. They have the same invasive species exposures as us, and they have done simply a much better job of controlling. Now, what I didn't focus on fully at the time was, I was focused more on passenger and air cargo. What I didn't focus on fully enough was cargo, shipping cargo, which is, after all, why we have a cookie frog here. You know, Christmas trees from Seattle, was it? So I have been working with the state to try to upgrade that bill and to work it through. Now, there's been some positive development since then, the last 15 years, so we have to recognize that and work it into the legislation. But fundamentally, we would try to come up with a better federal regime. At the time, the objections came from a number of sources. One source was the shipping industry, which didn't want to do inspections on the West Coast before, you know, they got off the boat down here. To some extent, the tourism industry, because they didn't want to hang up the, you know, the process of traveling here. Ease of travel was important, and then the USDA had a problem too, because they legitimate problem, which is that they didn't have the resources to implement what we were asking them to do, which was more inspection on the front end rather than back down here. So I would love to, you know, work with whoever wants to work on this. I'm going to try to get a bill in the next couple of months on this, just to get the discussion going again, because it's a it's a huge puka.
The Sea Grant program, I know, has been under some threat, and it's a really critical.
More than under a threat. The current budget, administration's budget was to zero it out pretty much. So we did actually restore it and increase their funding. And I did mean to respond to the comment of somebody over here about Sea Grant. They're really, really good.
Kaho'olawe, got spent down the trust fund with restoration efforts, and is at zero and starting up on state funding now. It's attached to the DLNR administratively. The state has started to support them for restoration purposes in the general fund budget, but it still is an area that just really, if there's an opportunity for federal funding for the restoration efforts, would be important. And lastly, I know near and dear to your heart is helicopters. We have helicopter issues in our state parks, Kokei, Napali Coast, Ha'ena. And also we see it in cultural sites as well, Hanapepe salt ponds, which comes through, that issue comes through BLNR because the helicopters operate out of the airstrip next to it. We have impacts and are just struggling with this inability to influence either state through the state process or the federal process, something that is a big problem for residents and people visiting natural areas.
Okay. Well, helicopters, I'm just about to introduce legislation in Congress to substantially restrict the operations of tour helicopters, to address, and by the way, small planes. So, for example, the tragic crash at Dillingham. Commercial, by the way, I should say commercial tour helicopters and small planes. So I'm not trying to go after private helicopters, military helicopters, first responder, anything like that. This is the tour helicopter industry, which I think is out of control and is a safety risk and is certainly disrupting all of us. I sat at an incredible ceremony at Pearl Harbor the other day for Naval Shipyard graduates, and we were right on the edge of Pearl Harbor, and they were buzzing all over the place, below the line that they should have not been below. I know where that line is. It's the Fort Island Bridge. They were substantially Mackay. That's just one example. We've got it in all of our national and state parks. It disrupts them. It flies over Punch Bowl, and obviously all of our communities. So the basic argument is, the basic problem is that the FAA does not regulate for anything other than safety to some extent, and they don't regulate time, place, and manner of operations. So my goal here is to impose those regulations and give states and counties the ability to regulate further along those lines. So that'll be, I'll do that shortly. So that'll address that. The other points, yep, all of the above. And one thing I wanted to mention was that Kristen and I have been sitting here talking to you. Hawaii, the long tradition in the Hawaii congressional delegation on the House side is we have two districts, right? We've got the city of Honolulu and we've got the rest of Oahu and the other islands. And the second congressional was the one I represented earlier, and Representative Gabbard now represents, and I now have the city of Honolulu. And we functionally operate at large. We don't really, we work together. We don't distinguish with where that district line is. But putting on my district hat for a second, if any of these areas are of particular relevance to the first congressional district, so between Makapu'u, Mililani, and Ko'olina, that's my kuleana, my specific kuleana. I would love to do some of this work there, because most of what we've talked about is really the second congressional, which is something we both care about. So we're going to work on it. But your comment on national trails is a good one from that perspective, because actually the appropriations bill we passed out does significantly increase funding to that national trails system. So that's a perfect opportunity, because we've got a lot of unprotected trails out there. And that's an entree a lot of times into protection of a larger area, like start with protecting a trail and then expand from the trail. Tulsi's been a real strong supporter of all of this throughout Hawaii. So it is a good partnership. So a couple of takeaways for me. I think we've, maybe more questions than answers here today. Clearly, if any of you have, hopefully this was a stimulating discussion, so you go home and think about it and talk about it. And when you're with that, please feed it back to us, especially some very specific priorities in terms of areas for protection and appropriation requests. So that's one category. Another category is, where do you need more information about how the federal government is actually authorizing, appropriating funding, implementing, regulating problematic areas with any of the federal agencies. We'd love to hear about it and work them through. Most of the folks in the federal government are very, very well-meaning. Sometimes they just don't quite understand Hawaii. So that's a little cultural translation is needed every once in a while. And then third, just stay in touch, because this is a partnership with all of you. We've got a lot of folks in Hawaii who care a lot about our natural resources, and I'm looking at this as a multi-generation into the future, long after I'm in Congress or even on this good earth. The work that we're doing now is directed there. So thank you very much. Today I have introduced into Congress my Safe and Quiet Skies Act. My act, which is now before Congress, is a direct response to 2 tragic accidents right here in Hawaii over the last few months, in which 14 lives were lost. These were not the only accidents throughout our country. We have seen repeated accidents over the last decade involving both the commercial tour helicopter industry and the skydiving industry. My bill is also a direct response to rampant disruption of our communities throughout Hawaii, with thousands and thousands and thousands of overflights per year over our residences, over our national parks, over our national treasures. Today we celebrate the fact that the USS Arizona is being reopened on Sunday, and yet on any given day, the skies above Arizona will be completely full of tour helicopters flying low, flying right over the Arizona, destroying the sanctity and the peace of that really precious monument. Now, we wouldn't be here if the tour helicopter and small plane operators were able to self-regulate, but they can't. That's not their business model. Their business model is to fly as often as possible wherever they can. And after all, what's not to enjoy about Hawaii? The fact of the matter is, though, contrary to what some of the tour helicopter operators will tell you, this is not a tourist island or a tourist state. This is a state of 1.4 million residents where we host tourists, but not at the expense of our safety, not at the expense of our community. When you take a look at federal regulation of our tour helicopters and skydiving operations, you discover pretty fast that there's virtually no regulation. Yes, there is some regulation of safety, but there's virtually no regulation of the actual operation of these aircraft in such a way as not to destroy and disrupt whole communities. That regulation doesn't exist. And furthermore, the FAA and the state and the counties will tell you that the FAA is the only place where whatever regulation exists occurs. You will also find that the National Transportation Safety Board, which has to clean up after accidents, they're responsible for investigating accidents. They have no regulatory power or authority over safety. They have the ability to recommend safety regulations that will provide for greater safety, and they have. They have done it with our tour helicopters, where we have seen significant accidents, not just here, but in Alaska and throughout our country. And they have repeatedly done it in the last decade or two with skydiving operations. They have not been listened to by the FAA. The FAA has considered those recommendations to be, not cost-benefit or whatever. The fact of the matter is that the only way this is going to be solved is through Congress clarifying the direction that FAA should be taking to increase small aircraft safety and to avoid disruption of whole communities throughout our states and our countries and our special places. And so this is what this bill does. Number one, it requires that safety regulations be upgraded to that which is present for virtually all other commercial airliners. Number two, what it says is that the aircraft operators must operate in a way that at least minimizes disruption on the ground. Minimum altitude requirements, which today they routinely deviate from. The reason that we're right here today is because this is one of the best examples of seeing the tour helicopters buzzing by, heading to Waikiki at about 150 feet off the water. Now, I suspect the tour helicopters have figured out that I was here today, and so I've been watching the track of their planes. As a matter of fact, just 10 minutes ago, a tour helicopter took off from Honolulu Airport and went down the entirety of urban Honolulu, not here, at an altitude of about 500 to 600 feet. 500 to 600 feet. Imagine what that does to those neighborhoods. And so my bill increases the safety regulation to comply with what the NDSB says should be in place. And it also requires 1,500 feet minimum altitude except for takeoff and landing. It requires no flying over national parks, national cemeteries, national historic sites, none at all. And by the way, security risks to Pearl Harbor. There are vital national security presences at Pearl Harbor that are routinely overflown. And they don't like that, by the way. They consider that to be a risk. And that shouldn't be the case. The tour helicopters don't have to fly over our national security attributes. Number two, no residential overflights unless decibel levels are strictly complied with. We now have the technology to have much quieter airplanes. Yes, they're more expensive, but that's the price to be paid for overflying residential areas. And number three, what my bill would do is to give states and counties with incredibly increased presence of these aircraft to come up with their own regulations if they want to. Right now they can't. For example, would it be reasonable for us to ask here in Hawaii for a limitation on flights between 8 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock at night on weekdays so we can have our weekends free? Would it be reasonable for us to ask that these tour helicopter operators not operate directly over residential communities, stay out to sea? Would it be reasonable for us to ask that they not fly up the most precious valleys and over the most precious resources where we're busy trying to enjoy nature by hiking in the Nepali coast? Would it be reasonable for us to ask that in any given day, only 20, just to pick a number, be allowed as opposed to 50 to 100, which is what is now occurring? I think these things are reasonable. I think these things are a trade-off. And I think that if the tour helicopter and skydiving and small aircraft industry doesn't start to be a far better neighbor than they've been, that these things will be imposed on them, and I will be one of those that tries to impose them. And so I hope that this is the beginning of a discussion. This bill is going to be pursued in Congress when I get back in September, and I hope that we can come up with a better understanding.